Joining me now, Matthew Johnson. He is the interim director of Beloved Community Ministries down in the Atlanta area. Matthew, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
Why don't we start just with, for folks who are just, I think, hearing about Cop City, explain to us what Cop City is. This has been something that has basically been in the works for about 2.5 years, if I'm not mistaken, maybe more than that. But give us a sense of what Cop City hopes to be, I guess.
Right. This was passed through in a middle of the night deal that even our city council did not know about in the early spring of 2021. Only because of the work of activists was this brought to the fore. This was done by Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, while our current mayor, Andre Dickens, was still on the city council. That it was approved to use this land that had been a part of the city's master plan for parks in 2017 to instead be used as what would be the largest militarized police training facility in the country. The two largest police departments in the United States are the LAPD and the NYPD. This will be 3 times the size of the LAPD's training facility. It will be 4 times the size of NYPD's training facility. Meanwhile, Atlanta has about the 19th largest police force in the country. Atlanta is already the most surveilled city in the United States since Operation Shield was implemented in 2017, which was also done by the Atlanta Police Foundation. This cannot be separated from the fact that Atlanta is the largest or the most Black large metropolitan area in the United States, where we also hold the record for the largest racial income disparity. For every $1 of the median household income for Black families, it is $3 for the white median household income. Despite the fact that Atlanta is touted as some type of Black Mecca, African Americans have a 5% chance of making it outside of poverty in the Atlanta area. What we're actually seeing is a Black political class and a Black upper class that has continually sold out the interests of the Black working class for their own benefit. And also, the thing to note is that Atlanta holds so Georgia holds what I think the ranking of 6 for Fortune 500 companies, and you have many more moving in. You've probably heard about it more so in rap songs than anything else. Bankhead Highway is having 90 acres taken out to be Microsoft's headquarters. Meanwhile, there's no affordable housing and people are being continually pushed out. So what we're seeing is that this is a confluence of factors that are probably far more impactful on the crime rate than anything else. And we've had a rising murder rate, although over the past 3 years, there's been a $32 million increase in the police budget. So it's not really keeping us safer, but it's really clearly protecting private interests. And so now let's bring this all together, right? So now there was this idea to build the militarized police training facility that we call Cop City that will be built in an area that's 80% Black, that already has significant flooding issues. Sewage from the Atlanta DeKalb water system floods the South River every time there's 1/10 of an inch of rain. And the Clean Water Act has an exemption where they don't have any timeline they're held to clean this water supply in South DeKalb, where it's 80%. However, North DeKalb, they're held to actual standards of when they have to clean the water. This is already being litigated. Meanwhile, we're about to have more development, more areas paved, so more flooding in a place that's already had a significantly poisoned water area, in a place that was the site of the Atlanta prison farm that used to be a plantation, right, before Native Americans were forcibly pushed off of the land.
Right.
So what we have is an exploitation of land at the expense of Black people that will further police violence. So it's a confluence of whether you're looking at environmental racism, police brutality. I mean, whether you're looking at, the racial wealth inequality, it's all happening right here. And you're having a forest movement and a forest protection movement right next to a major city, which essentially never happens.
Right.
So that's why this thing is blowing up. Sorry, I might have been running.
No. I mean, I think this is important context, because when we talk about why you would build a nearly 400-acre facility that it purports to create its own urban environment where you're literally training officers, cops, for warfare, when you hear the context in terms of the wealth inequality and the dispossession of political power that the Black community is dealing with in Atlanta, it's not that far of a leap to understand why the city will be looking to create essentially a force to control people in an urban environment. I mean, there's you really have two ways, I guess. Maybe there's more, but then they're not necessarily, and I don't think that they're as viable of dealing with this type of inequality, this level of poverty in instances, and this lack of a mobility. One is to address those issues directly. The other is to make sure that you've created some type of mechanism to control people who have to deal with that inequality. And it seems they've gone for the latter. And all right, so let's talk about, we are recording on Friday. The governor of Georgia has just declared a state of emergency to bring in 1,000 National Guardsmen, presumably to do what ultimately they're going to be training a bunch of police to do, which is to control people in the community and prevent them from having any type of say in this. Like you said, 17 hours of debate, and suddenly 400 acres that were designated for a more community-oriented purposes turn into a police training facility. And this is also coming in the wake of the police killing of someone who went by the name of Tortuguita. Can you give us, well, before we get there, tell us what the community's been doing. I know that the Beloved Community Ministries have been involved in this, that the community movement builders have been involved in this, that there's been a coalition to form Stop Cop City, and in conjunction with Defend Atlanta Force. Tell us about the resistance that has grown up over the past almost 2 years now to this plan.
Well, yes. One thing that I always like to distinguish about, for instance, Stop Cop City or Defend the Atlanta Forest, it's often thought of as an organization in the media. And I think that's very important for us to disambiguate, because it's more so a political stance or a movement, right? So it would be akin to saying that somebody is a member of pro-choice, right?
Right.
It's more so like it's like we're all a part of this effort to stop Cop City and defend the Atlanta Forest. And that's important because the way in which the police and federal agents and also the GBI have been moving has been threatening anybody that's associated with the movement as a part of a domestic terrorist network, right? So it's very important to note that this is not an organization, because they're trying to essentially create connections that aren't there. This has been a decentralized and autonomous movement. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, to be clear, I just want people to understand that that is not a theoretical situation. There have been 18 people who have been now charged with being domestic terrorists for supposedly belonging to a so-called domestic terrorist group, when in fact what we're talking about is really just people who are on a side of an issue that exists.
Yeah, you can't make this stuff up. Good old Georgia. Nevertheless, here we are. And what's happening now is I think that they've been losing in a lot of ways, and they're starting to show it. Just to give a little bit of context, this has been a decentralized and autonomous movement from the very beginning. Now, mind you, before any of this has happened, We have canvassed the neighborhood. We have been petitioning elected officials in DeKalb County, unincorporated DeKalb, where this land actually is, as well as in the city of Atlanta. There was 17 hours, a record amount of public comment, where 70% of it was against Cop City. However, it was almost an inverse correlation with the votes of the city council, where 10 out of 14, about 70%, voted for Cop City. This goes back to a Princeton study in 2016 that established that there's virtually no correlation between public opinion and legislation. In fact, that study also found that about 90% of us have virtually no say in our government, right? So we're looking at, once again, these issues of wealth and influence in the halls of power. So we've been going through, all of these channels. People have been doing tons of protests, marches, everything like that. And then perhaps there's been a little bit of trickery, right? You've had some instances of perhaps equipment being vandalized or things like that. And let's be frank, if we're looking at this empirically, these uses of force have been the only thing that have slowed this project down, and people sitting in trees. Now, just to note, on December 15th, people were pepper sprayed, shot with rubber bullets, and forcibly taken out of trees to then be charged with domestic terrorism, right? And to be quite frank with you, I believe that people being forcibly yanked out of trees and being charged with domestic terrorism, just for holding a certain issue, or people that were being yanked out of a parking lot and then charged with domestic terrorism, is much more in line with the definition of terrorism by threatening people for taking a political stance than the people that are actually sitting in the trees minding their own business, right? So we're just seeing the asymmetry of who's allowed to make these calls. And so we're just seeing immense abuses of power at the same time that, let's be clear, they are showing you right now what they plan on doing with this facility, right? They're using overwhelming force to attack people. And there's not really one precedent of a police officer being hurt throughout this entire ordeal up until these very questionable circumstances around Tortuguita's death. God bless them. And then also, we have to keep in mind that especially as we've moved forward with this movement and gained ground, the violence and the harassment has had an uptick.
Right. And
then also with that, they've essentially indiscriminately applied these charges to everybody. So what we have is significant abuses of force and indiscriminate charges, right, against people for virtually having some association with a political position. This is what happens in fascism. So for us to have this some notion that somehow they're going to completely flip the script and then use this facility to make police nicer, it's such a farce. But these are the things that even liberal politicians will try to convince themselves of, and it's never true.
It's what is fascinating about what we're watching. Well, there's many things, and I do want to get to Tortuguita's killing, which conveniently was not on body cam, although there were cams there. This dynamic of peaceful protests that are taking place, really no threat to any living human being, anyways, and the force that is being brought out, and it is sort of, there is an irony that this force is being used to essentially develop a facility to train forces like this and presumably do the similar thing.
That's exactly what they're doing.
And the classification of domestic terrorists who are engaged in this. I remember, and if I'm not mistaken, it was in Georgia. That in the mid-aughts, there were vegans who were protesting a honey-baked ham facility, and they were labeled by the Department of Homeland Security as domestic terrorists. And it's as if we're watching, like, these things that were, gamed out for vegans. And particularly, the fact is almost 20 years ago, the idea of vegans was I mean, there were vegetarians, but there was no groundswell. It was not a mainstream thing to be a vegan necessarily at that time. And the idea that was almost like a dry run, and we're going to take that playbook and we're going to impose it on people who are literally just camping in the woods. I watched a clip from The Daily Show of like a visit to the encampment, and it was, there's bingo night, there's people camping out. I mean, I've been to more threatening, RV stops, frankly, in the past, and to mobilize 1,000 National Guardsmen just gives you an a taste of what's going on here. So explain the circumstances in which one of these protesters, Tortuguita, was killed by police in a raid on this camp.
Yes. Well, I think there's a couple of things that have to be noted about that instance. First, we have the issue of the inconsistency within perhaps 2 hours of the murder. One, we don't even know if Tortuguita could have been saved. There was never a chance, there was never a shot. Meanwhile, the entire highway was shut down to get this Georgia State trooper to the hospital. So we already have a lack of clarity there. Initially, it was said that folks were ambushed by this person and then they shot. Within 2 hours, the narrative changed to this person being approached in a tent and shooting. I don't know how you ambush someone while you're in a tent.
Right.
It doesn't add up. Then, in the initial items that were collected at the crime scene, there was no gun. Then, I guess some folks backtrack, maybe produce a registration that then comes up with the gun. Now, let's also keep something in mind. We do have precedent of the police pointing firearms at protesters and even using rubber bullets. So there are significant, threats to folks' lives that have already been out there, and pointed weapons and weapons that were fired. So, if we live in a society where people can constantly make excuses for police officers that have very specialized training to handle crisis situations, to shoot kids, then I also think that there are some circumstances where someone who has a gun may adequately feel fear for their life and shoot back. These are the things that hit people viscerally and sound very strange, but let's be very clear that somebody can feel in fear of their life and be wrongfully targeted by police and perhaps shoot a shot. And I don't think that I'm not going to get into the game where we just immediately dismiss somebody as bad because they defended themselves, when the legitimate moral authority is certainly not in the hands of the police in so many of these circumstances where there are always shifting narratives. So the evidence around Tortuguita's murder is already very dicey. And I'm also not going to condemn them if they defended themselves.
And explain to me what has come out in terms of the body cam footage, because there's supposedly some footage that existed, but not with the people, not with the cops who approached the tent.
Well, yeah, it's all quite dicey, right? You had several different people from different departments and entities that were in the woods that day, besides Georgia State Patrol. Georgia State Patrol has been under significant scrutiny for years because of their unwillingness to wear body cameras. And there have already been instances where they have shot people out of frame with no context, and there's no explanation. In many cases, where no one else fired a shot. So this has been an issue of contention where they will not wear them. And they
coincidentally were the ones who were, I guess, like you could say, theoretically on the front lines they were closest to the incident, and
they're highway patrol. Why are they in the
right,
forest?
right.
We already have people with SWAT and militarized gear and camo. Like, I mean, there's no precedent of any police being attacked, but they had a huge bomb squad RV out there. I mean, I couldn't exaggerate how much militarized equipment they had around the forest in the past 8 weeks, and it's only expanding. Why do police need tanks? Like, what credible threat is there, like, in our population that would require that of police? It's too dicey. We're treating policing in this country as if it's some type of video game, constantly making like clear villains out of anybody that is pushing back against the will of the state, that's becoming more paranoid and more dangerous, and killing people at will and then making excuses for it.
What? How many people now were living in the forest as a means of protecting the property from being developed, and how many are there now? Like, give me a sense of what's happening in the wake of this killing, and now I guess, you know, I guess it remains to be seen what the response is going to be to the state of emergency that's been called, and the mobilization of 1,000 troops. I mean, it's nuts to me. They're obviously trying to bring in sort of, you know, this is almost a shock and awe campaign, as it were. What is the state of the protests that are going on, to the extent that you can? I imagine, like, you know,
I can't. I was going to tell you, I can't answer the first part of that question. And then also, I really can't answer the second part of that question, because here is the thing, right? Generally, people ask protesters how they are going to respond. But quite frankly, we never really dictate those terms, because it's the state that's using the violence. Right. And I'm not going to condemn people for defending themselves. I'm not going to do it. And I mean, folks have just been so heavy-handed. And I think that people have the right to protest this encampment. We went through all like legal channels and discourse. And if we have any value in civil disobedience and human life, we would not expect that of people. Because what we have seen empirically is that all of these legal channels that were laid out for us have not worked. And then to ask people to be silently mowed down and treated as if they are nothing and that their humanity does not matter, I'm not going to do it. I have an anti-violent stance, not a non-violent stance, when people are forced with continued violence and force.
What my understanding is that these 380, 400 acres or so, somewhere around there, is in a sort of almost like a quasi no man's land in terms of jurisdiction, where as far as I can gather, there is some like sort of like, it is in a weird sort of place jurisdictionally. And so once the city council refuses to basically, you know, really have a legitimate process, you know, 17 hours seems like a really truncated process. And particularly when it's hard to understand what the point of a public comment period is for, when the public comments are overwhelmingly against it, and there's no response to that. Are there other avenues in which, on a political sense, for people who aren't there directly engaged in the protest, are there other avenues in which there can be a political address to this? And where would they be because of those jurisdictional questions?
It's all very dicey, to be honest with you. The Atlanta is technically an unincorporated DeKalb, but it's owned by the city of Atlanta. In terms of getting the approvals for the land disturbance permit, I think that is in the hands of DeKalb County in terms of who owns it and who could rescind the lease. That is the Atlanta City Council. So both of these entities should be held accountable. Meanwhile, it's already in court because you also have a part where we should not let this individual, Ryan Millsap, off the hook, because essentially he mowed down tons of land that he owned, that he said that he did assessments on in order to properly build on it. Then he destroyed the land, realized that it was quasi-swampland and he couldn't build on it effectively. And then the city moved to swap that 40 acres with him to remove the public park that's, tangential to the Atlanta prison farm, right? And this is where there have been a lot of raids and attacks on individuals. And then they've been called, or they've had false charges placed against them. So you have like lots of weird land issues and the different municipal, state, county entities being in bed with corporate interests. So there's tons of weird that's happening here, where it doesn't seem like the will of people is being represented at all. And there are multiple entities that should be held accountable for that. And while we're on the subject of land, let's not forget that this land is tied to the South River that already has significant issues with flooding. Now you're going to pave upwards of hundreds of acres of this land where you're already seeing flooding in this Black neighborhood that already has at least 66% of the pollution of all of the South River in this very condensed area where Black people live. And then nobody's doing anything about it. You already have a landfill. The Atlanta prison farm was initially shut down because of how many prisoners died because of the poisoned water. Now you're gonna have lead runoff from a shooting range. Like, how bad is this going to be? And then meanwhile, the EPA specifically gave an exemption for this area where 400,000 residents that are about 80% Black live. And this is affecting their water supply. And then what we have is officials that will, make these symbolic stances against something like Jackson, Mississippi or Flint, Michigan, when we see it happening right now. Atlanta, although it has the second longest driver commute, doesn't have nearly the same problems with the air quality as Los Angeles. And that's deeply tied to our tree canopy, and it's being destroyed. This is the largest urban forest in the country that's in this Black neighborhood. And like large parts of it are in this Black neighborhood that's now being replaced for the largest militarized training facility in the country, perhaps the world, for police. Like, how tone deaf could these folks be? And I mean, how much clearer could the indications be that our elected officials are certainly not working for our interests?
Matthew, what can folks outside of that area do to support, the protests and the organizations that are working against this? There's some who are saying that this is going to be that it is developing into the next Standing Rock, where you had people all around the country who were going in support of local residents. We should say again, I mean, and you mentioned this, that this is also land that was essentially stolen from the Muskogee Creek people. So what can folks who are outside, who are watching around the country, what can they do to support your organization and folks who are fighting against Cop City?
Don't worry too much about my organization now. We'll be all right. But there are some things that you should really pay attention to. Please watch the Defend the Atlanta Forest page on Instagram. Watch the Stop Cop City page on Instagram. Watch the Atlanta Solidarity Fund. What we're dealing with right now is what maybe one or two of the folks that were arrested last week got bond, and it was $350,000. And it's because, I mean, this is unconstitutional.
They're trying to keep people out. They're trying to keep people.
They're trying to squeeze it because we've been, supporting folks down here through the Solidarity Fund to make sure that people that are fighting to preserve a livable world don't have too much financial strain on them, and they're essentially trying to bleed the fund. So please donate if you have the means. If you have influence, use it. This isn't one of those times where folks can sit on the sidelines and watch how things can play out. If you know anybody that has influence, pressure them, make the calls, and we need folks to show up. We really do. Let's dispel this outside agitator thing that will always come up, and the label of domestic terrorists. These are the same things that were said about Martin Luther King when he was in Chicago and he had his fancy PhD and moved to Alabama. These are the same things that were said about the Freedom Riders when they came to Mississippi. This is the same thing that al-Assad said in Syria, right, in 2011, right, to justify massive killings of people. So don't be scared. We need all the help that we can get. Atlanta is a city filled with, influential folks, especially, Black folks, people of culture and things. This is not the time to sit on the sidelines and protect your interests. This is not the time to cozy up to high people in high places. It's not okay. We need the support of people that have influence everywhere.
Matthew Johnson from Beloved Community Ministries, thank you so much for your time today. We'll put links to those Instagram accounts and to the Solidarity Fund at majority.fm in our podcast and YouTube descriptions. Thanks again. Really appreciate the work.
Much obliged. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.